Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This session features tools, resources, and guidance for providing English learners meaningful access to core curricular and extracurricular programs. On the next slide, I'd like to start by highlighting Chapter 4 of the English Learner Toolkit, which is focused on the topic of meaningful access. Chapter 4 discusses tools and resources intended to assist educators in providing English learners with equal access to advanced classes and gifted and talented programs. The tools included in this chapter provide information on how to access relevant school and district data, strategies for supporting English learners in meeting college and career readiness standards, and considerations in identifying and serving gifted English learners. Next, I want to highlight additional resources on this topic. In 2018, the National Center for Research and Gifted Education published a report on the identification of English learners in gifted and talented programs. This study was funded by the Office of English Language Acquisition, OELA. The research team at NCRGE implemented a large-scale study in 3 states with mandates for identifying and serving gifted and talented students. The research found that although overall across 3 states, English learners were not proportionally represented in the gifted population, the researchers were able to locate schools in which the percentage of English learners identified for gifted and talented programming was proportionally representative of the overall population of English learners. You can access the study at IES's ERIC link website, the Educational Research Information Center, by the link on this slide. Next, we highlight a research brief from the National Research and Development Center to Improve Education for Secondary English Learners at WestEd. The brief is titled How State District School Levers Can Improve the Course Access of Students Classified as English Learners in Secondary Schools. The brief synthesizes key findings about levers to increase course access for students classified as English learners in the secondary setting. Specifically, the research brief focuses on malleable factors that are within the control of schools and districts. In addition, I'd like to highlight several NCELA fact sheets, including the English Learners in Gifted and Talented Programs fact sheet, which presents data on the percentages and number of English learner enrollment in gifted and talented programs in U.S. schools during the 2017 and 2018 school year. The English Learners in Advanced Placement and International Baccalaureate Courses fact sheet explores the data on eligibility of AP and IB courses for English learners and English learner enrollment in these courses in U.S. schools during the 2017-2018 school year. And finally, the English Learners in College Credit-Bearing Courses fact sheet uses the 2017-2018 Civil Rights Data Collection to explore data on English learner dual enrollment and advanced placement AP exam participation for students enrolled in grades 9 through 12. Credits earned through dual enrollment courses and/or AP exams may reduce a student's post-secondary course load or shorten their time to earning a degree. Dual enrollment, dual credit programs provide opportunities for high school students to take college-level courses and earn concurrent credit toward a high school diploma and a college degree. Next slide, please. Additionally, we'd like to highlight 2 OELA webinars that discuss the resources on English learner access to all programs, particularly to the core curriculum. The links presented here connect to the webinar recordings. First listed on this slide is a 2021 OELA webinar titled English Learners in Secondary Schools, Trajectories, Transition Points, and Promising Practices. This webinar discusses what research has shown about the academic trajectories of English learners at the secondary level, including students identified as newcomers, students who have been labeled long-term English learners with disabilities, and former English learners. Next is a webinar hosted in the fall of 2022 titled Effective Literacy Instruction for Multilingual Learners, What It Is and What It Looks Like. This webinar shared research resources on literacy development for multilingual learners Presenters discussed best practices and leadership actions to promote effective literacy programs that honor the multilingual brain and leverage the linguistic and cultural assets of multilingual learners. You can access all these resources on this slide and the previous slide on the ENSELA website and through the links presented here. Finally, on this final slide, to recap, Chapter 4 of the English Learner Toolkit provides users with the guidance on how to ensure that English learners have opportunities to participate in programs and courses that enable them to attain English proficiency and provide meaningful access in all curricular areas, as well as providing equitable and appropriately scaffolded access to college and career readiness offerings, such as college counseling and career planning activities. This slide features some of the main points from Chapter 4 in the EL Toolkit. In the toolkit, additional guidance and information on ensuring meaningful and equal English learner access to curricular and extracurricular programs are provided. We're now going to turn it over to our panel, who will discuss practices and implementation in their context on this topic. Welcome, panelists. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists this afternoon. For our audience, you can learn more about our presenters from the presenter info tab in the app. Welcome Lissette Cologne-Collins, who is Assistant Superintendent for Language Acquisition Funded Programs, School Improvement, and the Arts at Yonkers Public Schools, and Roger Rosenthal, attorney with the Migrant Legal Action Program. Roger, the first question is for you. For the communities that you serve, what are some of the district practices that you advocate for to provide meaningful access to core curricular and extracurricular programs for English learners?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Maha, for that question. As you've stated, I'm an attorney, so I look at things from a somewhat broader perspective than maybe from a district or a state. And I've developed expertise, particularly regarding Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its application to ESL bilingual programs, English learners, and of course the parents of English learners. And I've seen both good and maybe not so good implementation of the requirements of the statute and the case law. The 1974 landmark Supreme Court case of Lau versus Nichols established the right of each and every English learner to an ESL or bilingual program. And when I work with folks, I advocate and ensure that people understand that even in a low incidence situation or one where there's maybe a child with one language where there are other languages in the community, every child has access to that ESL bilingual program. And I'll use ESL just as a shorthand today. So what Lau teaches us is two things. You have to teach the English learner to speak English, and also you have to provide access to content. And those are points that are very important for everyone, administrators and folks implementing the program, to understand. And then the case of Castaneda versus Picard establishes three-part test on what a legally sufficient ESL program would do. So you have to adopt a sound approach. So it's important for people, when we advocate, to understand what a sound approach is. You have to reasonably implement that sound approach, and you have to show outcomes reflecting the approach is working. All of those things are things that I advocate and that I help train to further amplify the reasonable implementation. If you have an ESL plan, which most people do, you must follow it. A deviation means you're not acting reasonably, and you must provide adequate resources, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then you have to, through your annual testing for English language acquisition, as well as your content tests, you have to show that progress is being made on the two things that LAO requires: access to English and access to content. And we need to remember that under ESSA, we're monitoring for 4 years kids who have left the definition of EL. And those kids also need to be monitored to make sure that they're not failing as a cohort.
Thank you, Roger. I can see from the chat, some of our audience members have had the opportunity to hear from you about this topic. And thank you for reiterating the case law and the policies that guide this work. Lissette, how does your district serve English learners, and how do you advocate for meaningful access in core curricular and extracurricular activities?
Thank you, Maha, for this question. There are critical actions that our district takes to ensure that we are able to advocate effectively for multilingual learners. One of them is prioritize the common understanding of what it is to have high expectations for multilingual learners, and ensuring that individuals at the leadership team, not just in the schools, teachers or principals, are able to distinguish between the different subpopulations of multilingual learners. In other words, do they understand that multilingual learners are not a monolithic group, that we have newcomers, that we have SIFE, that we have long-term ELs? It is important because as these folks go and have meetings and make instructional decisions, aside from me being part of those meetings, it is important that they have the knowledge to be able to do this work and support principals. And that includes the superintendent, that includes assistant superintendent, that includes content area teachers or directors that are able to actually select curriculum and also implement professional development that meets the needs of multilingual learners. And so another piece that is really critical for us is the actual instructional materials, right? Are the instructional materials really age and grade appropriate? Right? Do they allow for multiple entries for students to access content, whether it will be in the home language or in English, right? We need to make sure that they integrate language development with literacy and content. That is important. And so our materials have to have evidence-based results so that we are able to ensure that our kids are getting access to the content that they need. And another portion that is really crucial for us is using data to drive decisions and instruction. It is truly important that we differentiate, because within those analysis, we can actually identify the inequities within programs that are being provided. And so we are very adamant about the fact that any professional development or any decisions that we make are based on, disaggregating that data and making sure that it's used to provide instruction that truly meets the linguistic needs of multilingual learners.
Thank you, Lissette. That was really, you talked to us about how to individualize the instructional plan that Roger referred to earlier. And thanks for really highlighting the diversity that exists among the group that's collectively classified as English learners. We use those plans to be able to provide individualized pathways for students to developmentally appropriate and rigorous content instruction. Roger, I'll turn it back over to you. What advice would you give districts who are working to on program improvement to ensure meaningful access for English learners?
Well, I've chosen today to focus on 4 different areas of advice. The first is training, or as I might say, training, to really emphasize that. And it's very important that we think of this instruction in a really pedagogical way to encompass everyone who's involved in the school administration, because not only the ESL personnel need support and assistance in terms of getting an idea of the different approaches that could be used, particularly, as Lissette said, you get a greater diversity in a community that you didn't even anticipate, but also, very importantly, administrators who really need to understand what's necessary for ESL staff and others to be successful. And then, perhaps surprisingly to some, enrollment personnel who can actually make a very big difference in a child's future by the way they classify or channel a family or a student. And then finally, super important, non-ESL content teachers. And that's the super big challenge in our country, because we have so many content teachers who get English learners in their classroom, and they've not been given the tools to help these kids get access to the content, which again is the second thing that Lau teaches. And then three other areas, and I wanted to touch on this. I know there are sessions during this convening about special ed, but I wanted to be sure that folks focus on both how ELs interact or intersect with both special ed and with gifted programs. And special ed is very complex, as everybody knows, but I always like to give advice in two areas which seem to be fundamental and reflect problems that I hear when I go around the country. The first is that a student who would benefit from special ed and a student who is classified as an English learner has the legal right to both programs. It's not either or. You don't wait a year, you don't wait 3 years, you don't wait for the child to access English sufficiently. That's very important. And then to evaluate a child for special ed, if you evaluate, for example, an L1 in English, what have you got? A test of language proficiency. You're not able to discern whether there might be a physical problem, a psychological problem, a learning problem, because you're testing in English and they don't understand. And similarly, access for gifted programs, if you're testing in a language the child doesn't understand or in a manner that the child can't really focus on, then you may get a very skewed result. And two others very quickly. The third area of advice, which is very important to the future of kids, is appropriate placement, which should be age-appropriate placement with the support and structure helping them advance, even if they're very new to U.S. schools and very new to the English language. And as everybody knows on this panel, we have a wonderful Dear Colleague letter from January of 2015, which in its terms on page 18, for those who might want to look for it, page 18, there is a sentence which says that placement should be age appropriate. And that's very important for the psychosocial development of kids. And then finally, adequate resources. We need to be sure that we're not just giving the back of our hand to the program. Oh yeah, we have an ESL program. There have to be, as I said before, trained individuals. You have to make sure that you give adequate time to ESL. And in most states, there's not a time limit or a student to teacher ratio, but it has to be reasonable. And then where do you put your ESL class? Is it in a regular classroom, or is it in a janitor's closet or a noisy cafeteria where you can't hear anything? So all of those things are things that I advise districts to be looking for and thinking about as they're structuring a program.
Thank you, Roger. You actually connected to the content throughout our toolkit and the Dear Colleague letter. The audience is taking note of the page number that you cited. And I really want to reiterate one of the key areas that you highlighted for professional learning, and that's enrollment personnel, who are really setting up students for success from the very beginning of their education journey. Lizette, tell us what advice you have following some of the broad areas of the topics that Roger highlighted. What advice you give to districts who are working to ensure meaningful access?
Definitely, there is tremendous emphasis on professional development, but not just professional development or professional learning. It has to be differentiated for teachers, for our principals. When we do professional development, we ensure that our secondary principals are receiving the type of professional development that would allow them to schedule our students properly. A lot of our high schools need to be doing that. And so when we talk about principals that are at the elementary level, we also ensure that they get professional development to understand who is the population that is there, but how do we schedule it? How are the mandated services being provided? Right? I personally call each principal in this district when they submit reports, just because I want to give them the opportunity to have a safe environment with me to talk about the things that they might not want to, let's say, disclose in a big professional development setting. And so I think we need to create a community of learners among our administrators when it comes down to professional learning. That's critical for us. And then the second part is part of our blueprint for multilingual learner success in New York is that all our teachers are multilingual learners. And so when we do professional development, we just don't pull out all of the bilingual teachers and the TESOL teachers. We bring the content area teachers along so that we can provide professional learning around co-teaching, for example. It is a big piece of what we need to do. Here in New York, our regulations mandate that we provide integrated ENL. And with that, the training, the professional learning opportunities need to be with those teachers together so that they can plan together, so that they can make instructional decisions and know the students intimately. Another part that I think is really crucial and that has been one of the works that have been most satisfying to me is giving students voices. When we begin our professional development, we have decided not to hire a keynote speaker. Our keynote speakers are students. And so we put them on a panel, we ask them questions, we learn from them about their experiences about being multilingual learners and how we can make their educational experience better by changing simple things, such as giving them access to areas that they might not have, or giving them access to AP classes. I mean, they are very honest when it comes down to the experiences that they are having. And so I think that when we began the school year in that powerful way, empowering our students, but also inspiring our principals and teachers, I think that we have seen a tremendous benefit for all, especially for those teachers that consider themselves not teachers or multilingual learners, right? Because then they hear the perspective of our students, and it's beautiful. It's really a good experience. Then the other part is that we cannot talk about multilingual learners' success if we don't talk about meaningful engagement of the parents, right? And so for us, what that means is to be able to provide them with resources, opportunities for learning, moments in which they can come into the school and talk to the teacher about the progress that the children are making and how they can support. Here at the district level, we also provide plenty of professional development differentiated based on what we know that parents may need. We also conducted surveys to see what else do they need, and have an adult program that basically works together with us to make sure that we provide resources for them as adults. I already talked about the actual data and how important it is, obviously, to use it to drive instruction. And I want to talk a little bit about the provision of resources, because our principals are instructional leaders that are really immersed in educating all children. And so sometimes they might not have the time to select evidence-based resources or supplemental materials, or even scaffolding instruction and ideas for professional development. So we ensure that we provide them with those resources. All professional developers here in the district, we provide them with parameters as to what is it that you're going to do. We give them data. We also ensure that they aligned with the standards, that they align with the culturally responsive and sustaining framework from New York. They have to tell us which of the principles they are actually meeting when they are providing professional development, because it is truly important. It cannot just be professional learning that is general. It has to be intentional in the way that they plan it. And I think that all together, that allows us to then think about after school programs. How can they be more tailored to the needs of the students? Summer programs. So what we want is everyone to be able to contribute to the educational pathway of our students by doing different things. This is not just one thing that we do. It has to be a combination of strategies that need to be used.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. You know, working on program improvement in all areas, the classroom level, the leadership level, and really individualizing services across the district for students. I really like the example you shared of how you work with individual principals on problems of practice and really make sure they are addressing the needs of English learners. Roger, I want to turn it over to you with our last question. You, across the country, you provide professional learning opportunities for leaders and staff on this topic. How do you? What are specific ways that you work to build capacity across the country for staff who are responsible for ensuring meaningful access?
I know we're reaching the end of our time, so I'll try to be brief, and so Lissette can answer as well. But I thought of three different ways that are very, very different one from the other. We've talked about the issue of adequate resources already, and that has to be honest, somewhat of a top-down approach. We need to make sure that those who make budgetary decisions do it in such a way to provide adequate support not only to ESL teachers and to students and parents, but also to non-ESL content teachers. We can't neglect that. And there is a bunch of professional development money out there so that people can really look at this holistically. Another thing that's really important to me, which I think feeds into the capacity of a district, is to ensure adequate and competent parent interpretation and translation. And I see a lot of districts struggling with that. Parent involvement is key to the success of students, whoever the students are. And so it's really important to have that and to have a system of that. And then finally, for particularly the ESL professionals, finding allies in your district, and outside your district to help support the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Roger. Lissette, we have just a couple of minutes left over to wrap up. Please share a little bit more about professional development, how you build capacity in your district.
I think one of the most important things for us, aside from what I shared before, is also ensuring that we hire individuals that are qualified to really provide instruction, rigorous instruction to our students. So we actually work together as a team to interview and to make an effort so that our teachers have the knowledge and the expertise and the certification to be able to, address the needs of our students. I also, we emphasize our professional development around our new administrators as well. We take advantage of the fresh inspiration they have. They're coming into a new position, and for us, we take advantage of that moment and provide them with really significant professional development so that they, from the start, begin with multilingual learners in mind. I think that has been very important to us. And also, and I want to close with this, I don't want to underestimate the importance of supporting everyone in creating programs for our multilingual learners that truly are meaningful. When our children are receiving instruction in after school summer program or even in the core during the school day, they actually inspire us and teach us basically what we need. I had to tell you that one of the most rewarding programs we have created is the South Saturday Academy. It's a district-wide program where students are learning about literacy and art, and they they become published authors, right? And if you may, I want to just tell you, the first one we did is called The Recipe of Me, and they actually tell you what are they made of. 1 gallon of fearlessness, 125 ounces of bravery, and 15 cups of honesty, responsibility, and they go on, and then they make this beautiful recipe of who they are. And this is a book that is published with their photograph, and we have plenty of other books in the last 4 years. And so I
Thank
think
you
that
so much, Lizette. What a great note to end on. It's a great resource that I hope we can all see and access and explore. I'm going to turn it over to our conference organizers to wrap up the session and introduce the next one. Thank you so much, panelists.